Hello and welcome to the Ancient Jesus Future Faith podcast. I am one of your hosts, Tana Sheaver, and I am joined today and every day, not every day, just every day we record podcasts by Sarah Menardi.
Hello.
And Don Sheaver.
And every day with Don Sheaver.
That's fair. That part's fair.
Hello.
Anyway, today we are talking about the passage that is often referred to as the widow's mite or the widow's gift or the widow's offering. That is Mark 12:41 through 44.
I think this is one of those that's in 3 of the Gospels. I think it's also in Matthew. It's also in Luke.
Oh, okay.
I know we're going from the Mark one today.
Yeah, right. Yeah. So I'll read the Mark one before we get started. He sat down opposite the treasury and watched the crowd putting money into the treasury. Many rich people put in large sums. A poor widow came and put in 2 small copper coins, which are worth a penny. Then he called his disciples and said to them, "Truly, I tell you, this poor widow has put in more than all those who are contributing to the treasury. For all of them have contributed out of their abundance, but she, out of her poverty, has put in everything she had, all she had to live on." Now, whenever I didn't hear this taught on very often growing up, but when I did, it was sort of used as an example of like, you should give everything you have to the church. It was like almost like a command. See, this woman even gave her last 2 small copper coins. And yeah, so that to me, this passage has always been sort of like almost like a shaming into giving kind of a passage. Don, is that how you?
Yeah, I think it's typically, the way I've heard it is still that same shaming. I think a lot of times it's used to, you said give till it hurts. I'm not sure that, I think that's implied in some of the teachings that I've heard around it, but I think for most of it, my experience has been just this imagining of regardless of how much you have, you can always give. And in some way, even if you are destitute or poor, your gift can actually be viewed by God as greater than even someone who is affluent, who's giving significantly more than you. So, but it's rarely stated in such a way that feels like, oh, that sounds wonderful. Like, oh, I'm so glad. Instead, it feels like, no, you don't have an excuse not to give.
Right. It doesn't feel like joyful giving.
No.
Yeah. Sarah, I don't know if you have anything to say about how you were maybe taught this growing up, but I'm excited to hear you teach a little bit today about your view of this passage. So if you have anything you want to share about, how you heard this before you started studying it more deeply, obviously feel free. Otherwise, you just start in on wherever you want to start.
Yeah. Yeah, I think for me it was that the widow was being celebrated for her great faith in giving, and Jesus was pointing her out as like the positive example because she gave more. I think that's pretty much what I took away from the passage.
Like more of her income, like percentage-wise?
Yeah. Yeah. So when I had come across like a slightly different view of this and started digging into this, and in a couple of different translations, if I read them, I wonder if it's going to shift our perspective of this a little bit.
Okay.
For example, in the Amplified Bible, when we get to verse 43, summoning his disciples, he said to them, "I assure you, this poor widow has put in more than all those giving." That's what it was before. But in the Amplified, it says, "I assure you, and I most solemnly say, this poor widow has put in more than all those giving to the temple treasury." There's an addition of a word, solemnly. And then in the contemporary English version, at the very end of the passage, so before it was something like, "For they all gave out of their surplus, but she out of her poverty has put in everything she possessed, all she had to live on." And the contemporary English version adds, "Now she doesn't have a cent to live on." Or changes the ending to say, "Now she doesn't have a cent to live on."
This reminds me of like, we were just talking yesterday about taking songs like Happy Birthday and playing them in a minor key and how it like changes, right?
The feeling of it.
Particularly the contemporary English version there
Yeah.
is kind of like a little bit of an ominous spin at the end.
Now she has nothing.
Yeah, it starts to change it. And I think it begs the question, was Jesus suggesting that she be imitated for her great generosity, or should she be pitied as a victim of exploitation of the temple systems of that time? And that's the question I started to wrestle with. So when I went back to the text after thinking about this idea, that isn't my original idea, by the way, but when I went back to kind of like, look, well, maybe does this have any merit, this idea? I didn't see anywhere where Jesus says some of the things that you see him say in other parables or other examples, where you don't see Jesus saying, now go and do likewise here.
Oh, interesting.
You don't see him saying she's to be commended for her faith. You don't hear him saying God likes her more, right? But so I'm like, well, where do we get this positive celebratory idea that the widow giving everything she had, that Jesus is praising her? Are there even any words in the passage that would suggest that? So when you heard that passage, did you hear anything that was positive?
Well, I think there's a certain level of we view everything as prescriptive in scripture. So I think there's maybe kind of just that sort of layer, you know? And so you just sort of assume, since they're focusing on her, and then, you know, Jesus says, oh, this woman has put in more, you know, you just kind of assume like, oh, that must be a good thing. That must be good. Why he's, you know, and so that must be what I'm supposed to do.
Yeah. The automatic assumption that Jesus is using as a positive example.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. What about you, Don? Anything?
I mean, I'm trying to think through the passage. I don't know this passage verbatim or anything, but nothing stands out to me as her being specifically celebrated, or this being said to the disciples as a now go and do likewise type moment.
It's not there.
Right.
The funny thing is, honestly, if you read it without taking all of the lens or the assumptions or whatever of, you know, if you just read it, it's kind of like he's just like saying exactly what happened, just giving them the facts.
Yeah.
Hey, she gave more of her salary. It's a higher percentage.
Yeah.
Isn't that interesting?
Yeah.
Right.
And the disciples were probably like, good math, Jesus.
Right.
Yeah.
He just wanted to demonstrate his
Yeah.
observational skills to his apostles.
Yeah, and like when I look back at it, that word more is the closest thing I could come with pulling out something that would be positive. And I feel like the only reason I would think of more as positive is because of a Western lens.
Because we're American. We're Americans.
Yeah.
More is more.
Yeah, more is always better. But is it always a positive thing? No. I mean, obviously the rich people were literally giving more.
Right.
But so in my research, I found that the temple treasury was in the court of the women, which was named that because it was as close as the women could come to the sanctuary. So good thing they planned for the women to be able to give to the temple.
Right. They didn't plan for the Gentiles though, because the Gentile court was further out.
Oh, wow. So the treasury consisted of 13 trumpet-shaped chests into which free will offerings were deposited. The trumpet shape of the boxes amplified the sounds of coins as they were dropped in, so it was quite obvious when rich people were depositing large sums.
Oh, wow.
You still see this sometimes, like with some of the nonprofit work that I've done when I've spoken at a church. They'll use like a tin can and have people put their change into it, like change for change type thinking. And so it'll rattle so you can hear people doing it. I think that for us, like, how are you guys receiving that idea? Like, because based on the look on your face, Tana, it feels like you received that as a horrible thing. And yeah, so how are you receiving that?
It's so it feels horrible based on, you know, my lived reality. It feels like it could be beautiful based on the idea of the corners of the field and the idea that everybody would have been able to see each other's fields. And if whatever corners you left, We talked about this in another podcast. People could see how much you were giving, and that could feel celebratory, but it also could feel like pressure or shaming if you're not giving a lot. But that depends, again, on this concept of kind of what you were saying of more is, can we all be accepting of each other's amounts of giving without pressure or shame or whatever. But yeah, but based on how much baggage there is with tithing in the church and things like that, that feels like the trumpety, clang of it. It feels like pressure, or like the rich people get to brag and show how wonderful they are. And if you don't have as much, even if you're giving all you had and you put in your 2 coins, it's going to be like ding ding, instead of like da 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 da, like look at all they're giving. And it kind of makes me think too about when I grew up in the Catholic Church, they always passed the plate. Mm-hmm. Every evangelical church I've ever gone to, there was a giving was, at least as I can recall, it was like a thing. Like there was a place where you could go to give your, you put it in. But growing up Catholic, they passed it down the aisle. So you could see people.
Yeah. The giving box is relatively new to Protestant. And not all Protestant churches, a lot of Protestant churches still pass a plate or a pouch.
The one church we went to, I think they had these envelopes and everybody would just kind of pass them down the line, which was a little bit more anonymous than you actually having to take the basket and decide whether or not to put something in it and then keep going, But,
yeah, our Catholic church, you had your name printed on envelopes, and there was one for every week, so you would know if you missed it. We had a little box at home with the envelopes, and you're supposed to fill it in and bring it, and then the ushers would put the big basket on a stick down the pew.
The big basket on a stick.
Yeah.
Yes, I remember that.
Yeah, I wonder why, because like one feels worse than the other, right? Like what you guys are describing sounds worse than leaving the corners of your field, which I think sounds beautiful.
Mm-hmm.
But what's the big difference?
Right.
The corners of the field is being left for who?
Right, exactly.
And the temple treasury is going to where?
That's true.
There's a big difference there.
Absolutely.
Which is basically the gist of what we're talking about today.
Well, then good thing we brought it back around. Because otherwise we would have gone through another rabbit trail.
So looking back at this, I think we've touched on the idea of not letting chapter headings or pericopes interrupt our reading. And this is another great example. So if you aren't driving in your car and you have a chance to open up your Bible to Mark 12, you might be curious to see this by reading it along with us. But I'm going to actually back up a few verses and then read the widow's gift again and then go on a few verses. So when I back up a few verses, I'm pretty much ignoring the pericope that says the widow's gift or the widow's offering or the widow's mite, which, by the way, some of those have a more positive connotation too. So again, the pericope, influencing, like a gift, an offering sounds like a very wonderful thing. The mite, maybe not so much because that just means small coin, but again, the pericopes can influence us, but they're not a part of the original text.
A church treasurer wrote that pericope.
And then we get into chapter 13, which probably has its own heading in your Bible and a whole chapter distinction. But I would argue that we really should have read all the way to 13:2. So I'm going to start back at 12:38 and see how the verses before and the after also contribute to the story. So this is in a passage where Jesus is being questioned in a lot of his teaching. So my translation starts off by saying he also said in his teaching, and the he is referring to Jesus. So here we go. He also said in his teaching, "Beware of the scribes who want to go around in long robes and who want greetings in the marketplaces, the front seats in the synagogues, and the places of honor at the banquets. They devour widows' houses and say long prayers just for show. These will receive harsher punishment." Sitting across from the temple treasury, he watched how the crowd dropped money into the treasury. Many rich people were putting in large sums, and a poor widow came and dropped in 2 tiny coins worth very little. Summoning his disciples, he said to them, "I assure you, this poor widow has put in more than all these giving to the temple treasury. For they all gave out of their surplus, but she out of her poverty has put in everything she possessed, all she had to live on. As he was going out of the temple complex, one of his disciples said to him, Teacher, look, what massive stones, what impressive buildings. Jesus said to him, Do you see these great buildings? Not one stone will be left here on another that will not be thrown down. So just by listening to that, Don and Tana, did that add anything for you?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. It's really putting in context the juxtaposition of the widow with the wealthy, because now I'm not sure how scribes fit in that, but they say they have the best seats in the synagogues and places of honors at banquets. But they devour widows' houses, and then he goes on to say, "Oh, look, here's this widow giving everything she had, and she's given more than them."
Yeah. And I think, the idea of, devouring widows' houses is then, kind of implied there with comparison to God's house, right? The temple and the devouring of houses. So I think that there's a really interesting bookending almost in that.
Yeah. Because why would Jesus say or criticize devouring widows' houses and then praise a widow for giving her last 2 coins?
Right.
And then at the very end, when it goes into, like if Jesus is praising her, yeah, great, she gave money to the temple, let's keep the temple going. And then he leaves the temple, and what does he say? Like, it's all going to fall down.
Right.
It's who was it, Peter? Oh, I think it just says one of his disciples like, hey, this is so awesome.
It's totally Peter.
Look at our great temple.
It's totally Peter.
Look what we did with all of our money. And Jesus is like, it's just going to fall down.
Because Peter likes rocks.
Right.
Ba-dum-bum.
Yeah.
Yeah. Is it possible that instead of pious, wise Jesus saying, look at this widow, so burdened by life, giving her last 2 coins to the temple treasury, she has done better than these rich people? Is it possible that we have here Jesus righteously indignant, pointing out the unfairness? I assure you, seriously, solemnly, just look. She is giving so much more. She is giving her last coins. Now she has nothing to live on. And if we have a Jesus who throughout Scripture is telling us to help the widow and help the poor, then why would he be celebrating her giving her last 2 coins? Because what happens tomorrow?
Right.
Somebody's got to turn around and help her.
So Sarah, I think this is such a really wonderful, different perspective to read this text through. Wonderful being, a bit sad, right? But so when you're looking at this or you're reading this, are you hearing this as Jesus is criticizing the temple system, or Jesus is criticizing the way the temple system has been taught to people? Because I think about like what Tana said at the beginning about give till it hurts.
Yeah.
That isn't the church. That's the system, or that's the implication that her teaching or the teaching she received.
Right.
Like the church as a structure in and of itself doesn't require that.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
the people that are teaching us.
Yep.
So yeah, I'm just curious what your thoughts are about, because we could get into that area where it becomes the temple system was flawed or wrong for this, or I'm just curious as to your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. I mean, I'm not an expert on what the temple systems were, but it seems like the widow thought that this was what she was supposed to be doing.
Right. So something somewhere has failed her.
Yeah. And I feel like this passage can also be used to talk about how we give to the church. Like, I found an article, again, when I was doing research, that was talking about, what was the title? I think it was like how Jesus says to handle money or something like that. And this is a direct quote from that article. Jesus taught that a legitimate use of money is to support the Lord's work through the religious institutions the Lord established. And then the 3 texts that this article uses is this one, The other one is Matthew 23:23. Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You give 1/10 of your spices, mint, dill, and cumin, but you have neglected the more important matters of the law, justice, mercy, and faithfulness. You should have practiced the latter without neglecting the former. So I guess they're just making sure that you know that it says don't neglect the former, giving 1/10, because that seems like a very very much a stretch to use as a support for that.
Don't use the excuse of I'm helping my neighbor.
Right.
You still better give. So can I say something real quick about that verse?
Yeah.
So one of the things that's important to realize in that verse is that you weren't required to give 10% of those things. And so they were giving them out of piety, right?
Oh.
And so they were actually going above and beyond what the law had required, right? And Jesus is acknowledging that by saying 10% of your cumin and your spices, all that stuff, right? But then is arguing that that's great, but that doesn't give you permission because you're doing extra in the giving end to then ignore justice, mercy, and compassion. In fact, I'm telling you, don't abandon one for the other, do both.
Yeah.
And so this could actually be read as given till it hurts also.
Yeah.
Because those tithings were not required by the law. And so they're actually saying, look at how much extra we're giving and doing that other people aren't. So yeah, it's interesting that kind of fits with your reading of the widow's mite. So yeah.
And the third example was Luke 8:1-3, the parable of the sower. So after this, Jesus traveled from one town and village to another, proclaiming the good news of the kingdom of God. The 12 were with him, and also some women who had been cured of evil spirits and diseases. Mary called Magdalene, from whom 7 demons had come out. Johanna, the wife of Chuza, the manager of Herod's household. Susanna, and many others. These women were helping to support them out of their own means. And that's where it stopped.
Oh my gosh. I imagine the person that wrote this article is very respectable and very knowledgeable, and I should not be laughing.
Why are you laughing?
Because these are terrible examples.
Well, it goes to the point, I feel like this is kind of stating the obvious, and I'm not trying to suggest that our listeners don't already do this, but I know I've maybe not done this all the time, so I'm just going to say it, but sometimes you have to do that extra legwork to look at the examples that people are giving you. I remember being in a Bible study, and I've told this story, I think, to Don before, where it was arguing a certain thing, and I don't want to get into it because I don't want us to go on a rabbit trail, and it had 12 verses that supported.
You know me so well.
It had 12 verses that supported it. And so I actually painstakingly went through the Bible and looked at all those verses and looked at the word that was common, the words that were common, and there was a common word used in 11 out of 12 of the verses. So if you got that translation of that word wrong, which is a word that is up for debate, then your whole argument falls away. So it looks like you have 12 verses, but really you're giving 11 verses that use they're saying the same thing. So it's really one argument.
Right.
And then the other one was a different one. And then
that would be like using the widow's mite 3 different times from the three different gospels.
Yeah.
Yeah. And saying this.
Jesus said this 3 times.
There's 3 evidences of this.
Yeah. So,
Wow.
But yeah. And I also think of how many verses we see, especially in the Old Testament, of God telling us to take care of the widows.
Absolutely.
And we also, I don't know, do either of you have an image of the widow in the story? How has your mind painted the picture of the widow?
Who is the oldest of the Golden Girls?
The mom or the
the
3?
mom.
Well,
the mom.
she was actually the youngest.
She was the youngest actress. That's true.
But she played the oldest.
Sophia.
Sophia.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's honestly.
Estelle Getty is the actress's name.
I picture Sophia.
Picture it, Sicily.
Yeah.
I'm in a church.
Yeah. I was actually embarrassed as soon as you said, how do you picture it? And immediately I knew exactly who I was picturing.
But no, I actually had the same thing. I thought as soon as you asked that question, I thought, you know what? Not all widows are old,
Yes.
but I totally pictured her as old.
Ouch. I didn't even consider that own condemnation right there until you just said it. Like, I didn't even perceive that I was applying an assumption.
Yeah.
I mean, I was applying an assumption that she was a white older lady,
Right.
and I understood that
In
assumption.
the Middle East.
Yes, in the Middle East.
Yeah, but I mean, I assume that she's old, and I don't know. I think I also assume that she's like somewhat crippled too.
Yeah, me too.
Frail.
Which has nothing to
Yeah.
do with being a widow.
Which is interesting because I feel like that's something, and I don't know if it's a biblical thing or if it's just a societal thing, but I feel like that's always this assumption with, widows. Like they're older and frail and sad.
Which, I mean, it stands to reason that many widows are.
Yeah.
Right. I mean,
But-
it's more likely. Right.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But still.
But she could have been a young widow. She could have children at home that she has to take care of.
Right.
And, I think of just so much of the text telling us to take care of the poor, to take care of the widows, that it just makes me ask the question, like, why would Jesus be celebrating her giving her last 2 coins so that she can build her faith in the hope that somebody comes tomorrow to take care of her? I don't know.
Well, I believe isn't that part of like the wealth gospel that if you give your last thing to maybe certain televangelists or whatever, God will reward you.
Yeah, it's just
Prosperity gospel.
It's just like a tenfold mindset. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, Sarah, if it isn't about give until it hurts, what is this about?
How do I summarize it?
Well, you don't necessarily have to summarize it. You can walk us through something if you prefer.
Yeah. Well, I think that this lens challenges me from the more is better idea, or that giving it all to the church I think what this lens gives to me, or how to answer your question possibly, is that to notice that we should be taking care of the poor, which kind of goes back to the love your neighbor idea. Mm-hmm. That we should be providing for the needs of the poor, that we don't always have to put our money through a middleman. Mm. And I actually remember being taught that a lot, that if we were going to give, make sure you're giving to a reputable institution instead of giving it to the person that you meet on the street, because what are they going to do with it? And that moral compass idea. And I think this pushes back against that a little bit, that we should be taking care of the people in our lives right in front of us directly.
Yeah.
And also, I think it points out that it's weird that, like, in Christian circles, giving to the church and giving to the poor can become this messy, synonymous thing. Did I use the right word? Like, even when we were talking, like, I was with you, Tana, because for some reason it was bringing up the corners of the field, but the corners of the field was talking about leaving for the poor, and this was talking about giving to the church. But somehow in my mind, it just feels like it's weirdly intertwined.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying that it's wrong to give to churches, and that, I think we do need to support churches, but I think that there's a lot of questions about how churches use money that I'd love to hear more discussion about. Like, where is the money that our church is using? Is it going to help the poor? Is it going to help our communities? And how much of it is? And how much of it is going into creating a nice, safe, comfy experience for people? And it's elevating all of these things that end up costing money just so that we're creating this, like, picture perfect experience that I would, on a tangent, probably argue that plays on people's emotions as well. But all the money that goes into that, all the money that goes to even owning buildings and maintaining buildings. Right. And is that really, is the overall way that our churches are spending money reflective of how Jesus would have wanted us to, and how God in the Old Testament tells us to take care of the poor?
Well, and when you read on to 13, I believe, if I'm remembering, that he said something about like, look at this. And Jesus said, well, that'll be gone.
Yeah.
And that's an interesting thing that I've often thought about, all these very opulent churches, that period of time when, they're beautiful, but,
Yeah.
large cathedrals and everything were built. Sometimes I wonder, what do they think about those types of verses?
Sarah, would you be willing to read the few verses that you read prior to the widow's mite section
Yeah.
again, please?
So this is Mark 12:38. He also said in his teaching, beware of the scribes who want to go around in long robes and who want greetings in the marketplaces, the front seats in the synagogues, and the places of honor at banquets. They devour widows' houses and say long prayers just for show. These will receive harsher punishment. And then it goes on into the...
Yeah, I'm listening to that. I think that to me is so key for then reading the widow's mite. And I thank you for introducing me to that way of reading the widow's mite, because it is really fascinating that it is also kind of juxtapositioning more than just the money. It's also that it seems that it's implying, well, it doesn't seem, it is implying that affluence and certain people with affluence do extravagant things in order to call attention to themselves, right? And in so doing, it seems like they're doing good things, right? It appears as though the things that they are providing are wholesome. But what it also does is it's built from a place of insincerity. I'm kind of processing this out loud, which is not a great thing to try and do. But
That's okay.
But then the widow, however, seems to, I don't think she's a fool. So she's not imagining that her penny worth of offering is going to be the difference between the success or failure of the temple and how they use it, right? It's not going to move a Levite from struggling to now being prosperous. It's not going to add to the charitable food distribution that the temple did amongst the poor. It's not adding a lot. So her participation here is strictly about the heart of it, right? Like, and there's something very sad to me that is coming out of this, and I relate, I think, to that idea of ness. That Jesus in some way is looking at this moment and thinking and saying, this widow is giving such a significant portion of her well-being because she believes in what the temple does. For all we know, she's received generosity from the temple.
Yeah.
She's received corners of the field from neighbors. She's received, and maybe she has been taken care of and her needs are met, but she doesn't have additional beyond what she has in her hand. And yeah, I'm wondering about how this idea of creating spaces in which people that believe in the heart of what is being done within those spaces and maybe have even received well-being from those spaces, when they give, they're giving oftentimes from a very different place than someone who doesn't need the well-being, who doesn't take advantage of the outreach or whatever it might be. And what other lessons there are in that for us when we're thinking about how we discuss need in the church.
Yeah.
And how we do it in such a way that changes both people, right? the scribe or the Pharisee or whoever it is that gives a large sum, and also change the way that the widow feels. That, yeah, I think it's really interesting. I'm processing. So
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I was just thinking, at our food pantry that we had at one point at New Harvest, a church that I had pastored at for a while, the people that came in and utilized the food service we had, eventually they asked us to put up a donation, a tip jar type thing, a donation jar, and they would come in to get food, and they would put in some loose change that they had into this. And I think in my mind, I've comforted myself, or I viewed that as kind of a widow's mite moment.
Yeah.
And now I'm wondering what could be critiqued potentially about that space. Yeah. I don't know. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, well, I think we miss a lot of details about the widow's motivation or the widow's influences, the widow's what she's experiencing as she gives her last two mites. It's just not there. Like, is she, like you said, giving her last two because maybe that's a way that she feels connected to God, or a way that she can like thank God for like the provisions that she's had? Is she giving her last two mites because she wants to make sure it goes to the temple before she goes off and dies and has nothing else? I mean, it's just, there's so much to the story that we don't have to help us with that piece.
Yeah. For me, the big pieces in this is the destruction of the widow's house and the destruction of God's house. Right? Like those two pieces are so significant when reading this that I never put those together prior. And I feel like at the end of the day, that's what's at the heart of this is this misgiving, no pun intended, of how to participate without it being destructive.
Yeah.
And then the sadness that Jesus has as this woman is participating possibly in her own destruction of her home, knowing that the temple also, that God's house, not just the widow's house, but God's house.
Well, and it's not far before this in Mark that we have Jesus clearing out the temple and turning over the tables and things like that, which is, I think, reading a broader context to try to get of what is Jesus trying to say in all of these stories, that it's the same temple that we're talking about, that he was in and clearing it out. And then another one not far before this is the rich young ruler who's asking Jesus what to do. And after following Jesus asks if he's followed all the commandments, and he says yes. And he says, well, give your money to the poor and give everything you have to the poor and follow me. And just notable that he says, give your money to the poor, not give your money to the temple.
Right.
In that instance. So I think that's another useful just tool that as we zero in, and as much as we like to study and focus on a passage, but the stepping back and getting the verses before and after, and then stepping back and getting the whole book to try to get what themes are coming out of this book that might connect and help us better interpret stories that we've heard taught many times. And going in it with that fresh lens, that we've heard this one way,
Right.
but is it possible that it's a different way? And I think that's why we celebrate questions so much, because even if this is totally off and wrong interpretation, it has led us down a path that has, I would say, brought us closer to God, brought us closer to taking care of God's people as we think about this and discuss and just like ask those questions. And that's always a beautiful thing.
Yeah.
So I had a question, and it went completely out of my brain. From the moment I said the word "so," it disappeared. So I will ponder that, and one of you say something.
Yeah. Well, I mean, one thing that I had to share that I'll just throw out there is that there are also verses in the New Testament that we see the same idea. Like in James 2:15-17, suppose a brother or sister is without clothes and daily food. If one of you says to them, go in peace, keep warm and well fed, but does nothing about their physical needs, what good is it? So just meeting.
So thoughts and prayers
Yeah.
don't count for anything.
In the same way, faith by itself, if it's not accompanied by action, is dead. So just this reminder. So if Jesus is sitting in this temple, and here's me just playing and imagining, and some of his disciples are around him, and he says this woman has given all she's given, and then they just like watch her leave. It's like if she's given all she's had, doesn't that mean that we need to step in and help her?
Right.
And in 1 John 3:17, but if anyone has the world's goods and sees his brother in need, yet closes his heart against him, how does God's love abide in him?
I remembered my question.
Yeah.
So I'm curious about so it mentions the synagogue here. Was there misuse of the money given to the temple or the synagogue? And was it done in the same way that I would argue it was done later? There's all these historical examples of corrupt churches, right? Of them taking the money and using the money for everything but helping the poor, or just, trying to maintain a presence where people could gather and, all that stuff. So you have the super opulent churches, and then maybe more recently, you have pastors getting private jets and, so I'm just curious.
There was just a pastor that got robbed in the middle of his church service, and they stole over $400,000 worth of jewelry off of him.
There you go. So
yeah, it's called like the bling. If you Google like the bling pastor,
the bling pastor. So, yeah. So I guess my question is, at that time, was that happening, or is that a later manifestation?
So I would just say that where there's people, there's corruption.
Sure.
So
Fair.
So I don't think we can put rose tinted glasses on, nor do I think we can just say I don't think there's evidence of misuse in any major way. Let me say one other piece real quick, and we have to be careful. The synagogue is the correlation to the church. The temple, we do not have anything like the temple.
Okay, thank you.
In Christianity currently. Maybe Christianity is in Catholicism, you could argue.
Like the Holy See is the temple or something.
Sure. But when we're talking about this, there is a difference between what the people did to support their local synagogue versus what they did at the temple. And we don't really have a one-to-one comparison anymore to that. And that's just something, I'm not saying there's nothing to learn about that, because I think that there's a lot for us to learn about this story and about how people are asked and expected to give in our churches. But the passage does reference the prior to this section mentions the synagogue, which would have been more akin to our local churches.
Okay. The reason I was asking is because of this difference that Sarah mentioned between like giving to the church or the synagogue and giving to the poor. And some of the verses that people might use to try to encourage their congregants to tithe more faithfully or give more to the church or whatever. I wonder if there's things that have changed in the way that the church behaves today versus how the synagogue behaved back then that would make those sort of moot anyway, or at least different in some way.
So the synagogue would have been more likely, if you were fortunate enough to have a synagogue in your community, it would have been public education. So you would have gone there as a child to learn. You would have been able to go there as an adult to learn. And we can't confuse Sunday school with what they were doing at the synagogue, right? Like you're being taught how to read, possibly taught how to write. You were like, so there was a lot of things going on educational wise within the synagogue that is not part of what the temple was attempting to do, right? So the local synagogue was much more kind of like I don't even know what I think the YMCA had hoped it would be in each community it was in, right? That it was a place, a space that you could go and learn, you could exercise, whatever it is, right? Like, so a community center would have been more so the mindset. And so one of the things that when we talk about giving in the church that is often misconstrued is that there were so many levels of giving within the Israelite culture that when we get anxious about the idea of 10%, it doesn't even begin to touch what the offerings and stuff that Israel was doing. And now I'm not trying to encourage that people do what we said at the beginning, which is give till it hurts. I'm just saying that, you were already leaving the corners of your field. That had nothing to do with then your offerings at the temple. That also had nothing to do with any contributions you made in your community beyond leaving the corners to help those in need. It also didn't remove any obligation or desire to help the local synagogue, where you had probably a teacher that was dedicated to that space to educate your children or the children of the community, as well as the adults, and teach them the text and wrestle with faith, which was ubiquitous, right? Like you didn't decide whether or not you were a person of faith in this time. You just were. You were Jewish, therefore you weren't just ethnically Jewish, you were also faithfully Jewish. So yeah, there's so much here that is interesting to me, which is why I think I keep going back to the part that has me so enamored is the God's house, widow's house destruction thing. And, we've talked on the podcast and, just personally amongst the three of us so many times about God really identifying a lot with women, barrenness, pregnancy, all of these things, right? And is this even Jesus again making this? Because we have these passages in the text that say, don't bring an offering to God if your neighbor's hungry, right? And so is there something here about like, as your widows' houses are being destroyed, and yet the widows are the ones that are bringing a vast amount of their own well-being to this space, my house is going to be destroyed just like the widows' houses by this type of behavior, this type of thinking, this type of interaction. So that's what really has my mind going.
Yeah. Interesting.
Yeah, it's like you said, it's like bookends of the story.
So can we pull this to a practical place, even if, because I think what is left as unaddressed is, does this mean that we should just stop giving to anything other than directly to people?
I'm sorry, Don. Are you asking for application?
Yes.
Well, that's fair. He's asking for it. He's not offering it. So
That's true.
That's keeping in with.
That's keeping yes.
I feel like what I'm taking from today is this idea of, giving till it hurts, because there's this one and the rich young ruler that you mentioned, Sarah, that I feel like are used in that way, of which I fully embraced early on when Don was early in his ministry and was hardly making anything. And I was working for a nonprofit. I wasn't making a ton of money. And even though we could not afford it, we tithed 10% to the church he was working at for next to nothing. I think we tithed more than he made. So that really messed us up financially. But it was this obligation in my mind of, well, it doesn't matter what our financial status is and what our bills are and all that. You give the 10%. That's it. No matter what it does to you.
Yeah.
And so what I'm taking from this is that that's not good and healthy, and that perhaps maybe sometimes also there should maybe we should direct our funds towards the poor. But like you said, Don, I don't think that also means you don't support churches. I think there's of course I'm biased. I'm married to a pastor. So I think that might be playing into it a little bit, but I think we do need to support the people who are teaching us. And if there is a building you're meeting in, obviously there's some expenses there, but I think there's a limit. I think that line might be different for every church and congregation, for every person, but I believe there is a level of opulence that maybe we should be interrogating.
Yeah, and I think it kind of leads to like another thing that has always rubbed me the wrong way, because I have many friends who have worked for churches and worked in missions, and I was just thinking that like I think it's like this passage, when read in this way, opens the door for reflection and asking the question, how do we define success? Is success always a bigger building? Is success always more people? And are we putting so much money towards that end that we're not taking care of the people right in front of us? Because it bothers me immensely that there's this celebration of people working for the Lord and not getting paid a livable wage.
Right.
And that's honorable.
Because it's a calling.
Yes, it's a calling.
Right.
It's a mission. So you shouldn't expect to be paid fairly. And it rubs me the wrong way, because, and I think it goes into this, like, there's so many emotions tied around money. Like, money just carries this like negative connotation. Giving it all carries this positive connotation. Yeah. Living simply carries a more positive connotation. And that, but like when we're not paying the people who are running our churches, our schools, our ministries a living wage, like money is morally neutral. We are quite possibly denying them the chance to take care of their health or the health of their family.
Right.
Or denying them the chance to eat food of a certain quality. There's like so much that gets tied into it. And maybe I'm ultra sensitive to this because of my own health issues and knowing like what a money pit it can be, just trying to like find answers and things like that too. But we mentioned in the corners of the field that people left the corners of their field and that was currency. And as I thought about that passage after we had talked about it at our church, it occurred to me that like, I don't think I've ever heard anybody say like a farmer say, well, I don't do it for the money, or, you know, or right. I don't do it for the crops. Like, no, you work the field to get the crops.
Right.
So you teach at a Christian school to make money. That's part of it. And there's nothing wrong with that. Right. You can be called and you can be passionate, and I hope you are.
Right.
But you deserve to be paid fairly to be able to take care of your health and the health of the people in your circle, and to be able to take care of your community so that you can take care of the person that you see in your neighborhood, in your life that needs help. And I just internally like protest against it being honorable to work for less because it's a mission. I'm sure, I don't know. There's a lot that goes into that. I'm kind of passionate about it. And I mean, I think that I don't want people to walk away and say like, well, like, you know, we shouldn't start missions if we can't afford it. I'm just saying that like, we need to think about the people and not think that money is a negative thing, or if that you're running an organization and somebody's telling you that they need more money to live on. It's not just because they're greedy. It's not just because, you know, like right. I just want to open this idea of moving towards that, because I know that ministry, I mean, money doesn't come from anywhere, right? So yes, we should start ministries, and yes, there will be hard times, and we can't, but if we know that our ultimate goal is that we're not just building more buildings and buying more tech equipment and marketing more, but we're also taking care of the people on our staff to an acceptable level, which I'll just be like the Old Testament and leave that very vague.
Right.
Because I don't have the answer for that either. But yeah, so I don't know. Any thoughts on my tangent?
I think what it does is, if we're going to take this passage in kind of the way that we've read it today and our discussion today, and we're going to take it seriously, then I think what it calls us to, or obligates us to, is how are we utilizing, what is this money going towards? Is it to keep stones upon stones? Or is it to keep widows' houses from being desecrated or destroyed, right? And that doesn't mean that there aren't overhead costs. It's just that we celebrate maybe the overhead cost because, well, look at the building or look at the space. And really what we should be doing is, how does this used for humans? And I think sometimes we put our capital into the wrong things. And part of that then gets passed on, right? Innocently, I think, hopefully not maliciously, but the number of times, we're a small church, and I've had so many people come and go over the years because we don't have a dynamic children's ministry. Well, we don't have the people to have a dynamic children's ministry, and but more opulent spaces will use that as a marketing or a selling point. And I think that that's great that they have and are able to invest in those spaces. But then what that has become is an obligation then for every church to do it, right? Or, the way that they do music or anything like this. So the overhead investment that is put in becomes the standard bearer for other communities. And I'd just be really curious time traveling is not something I'm good at, but it would be interesting to see what the synagogues look like from one city to another in ancient times. Did they wrestle with the same things we wrestle with today? That there's one place that's kind of a small, rundown space, but alive with people from the community, and then there's another, extremely large and decadent space that also is meeting the needs of the people, and to understand what they wrestled with in the midst of making those decisions. Because I just don't think we're good at, I think there's expectations of what a church needs to have in order to be a church. Mm-hmm. And because of those expectations, we have widows giving their last penny.
Right.
And that's sad.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it seems like a good place to wrap up, unless you all have any final thoughts.
No.
No? All right. Well, thank you both. Thank you, Sarah, especially for all of the research you put into this.
Yes, and opening this passage up to a different way. Really appreciate that.
It has me thinking. So thank you for that. And thank you all for joining us. And if you're listening, please like, subscribe, rate, review, wherever you get your podcasts. That'll help us out a lot. You can find us in between podcasts on social media, Ancient Jesus Future Faith. Just, find us. You can email us at info@ancientjesusfuturefaith.com if you have any questions or suggestions for future podcast episodes or whatever. So thanks, and hope to see you next time. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.